Oh, we are. Okay, here we go. We are going to do lecture number 4, which is Africans in the New World. We've looked at how Native Americans got here, a very truncated version of that, and we've seen how Europeans got here. And so now it's time to look at the third group who came to the Americas, and that is Africans. So let me Oh, hang on for a second. I got to pause this so I can pull up the necessary PowerPoint. Okay, we're back. All right. Get another whiteboard, so to speak, here. Why were slaves needed? Why were African slaves needed in the New World? The main reason is that in the Spanish colonies, they were running out of natives to enslave. Um, we didn't talk too much about the Spanish slave system, but natives had been used for slavery. And as that population began to diminish, another source of labor was needed. And as we're going to see, the Spanish are simply taking the idea of African slaves from the Portuguese, who themselves had taken it from what is now Italy. And we'll look at how all that sort of comes together as we make our way through this. Now, slavery has always existed throughout all of recorded history, but there are different forms of slavery. In antiquity, that is to say, old-timey slavery, slavery was usually based on circumstances, not on racial or ethnic characteristics. So you might have a slavery based on prisoners of war, criminals, or debtors, debt slavery. And so if you look at Roman slavery, Greek slavery, the slavery you're familiar with in the Bible, probably, that is slavery based on circumstances, not on an easily identifiable racial or ethnic characteristic. And this type of slavery was usually not lifetime. Obviously, if you were a debtor, once you had, assuming you had an honest master, once your debt had been paid off, once you were a criminal and your sentence had been paid off, if you were a prisoner of war, you could probably be exchanged for other prisoners of war. So it's very, very different from the slavery that was practiced here in North America and South America and the Caribbean. Where this began to change, where we start to see a slavery based on a racial or ethnic characteristic, is about the 7th century. During the 7th century, as we can see here, let me sort of adjust this, we have the conquest of much of the Middle East, but also Africa by the Islamic world, as it is called here. But people in the Middle East, driven by religious beliefs, spread out throughout the Middle East and spread out into Africa. And this really sort of brought them into contact with both white people in Africa, which would have been along this section, basically the old Roman Empire, but it also would have brought them into contact for the first time with Black people in Africa. The white people in Africa, and this is a truly tragic story I'm about to tell you. Again, it's this old Roman North Africa empire that had stretched from Egypt all the way up along through here. Again, those are mainly descendants of the old Roman Empire, along with some of the Vikings that had made their way to that area. It's kind of outside the scope, but what's important to know is that the white people in general were technologically advanced. And unfortunately, the part of Africa, the part of Africa where Black people were living, had gone through multiple civil wars that had decimated the people and their villages, towns, whatever you want to call them. And so this part of Africa where the Arab conquest began brushing up against Black Africans had pretty much been laid waste to. Imagine if you came from another planet in 1945 and met concentration camp survivors, okay, Jewish concentration camp survivors, and based on your interaction with them, okay, you assumed that this was what all Jewish people were like. And that's kind of what happens here. They come into this part of Africa where civilization has been laid waste to by multiple civil wars. Those civil wars had led to agricultural collapse, which had led to civilizational collapse. And so it had been easy to enslave these decimated Africans, and it had been easy to justify it because taking a look at this peoples in Africa who were living in a place where civil war had wiped out civilization versus the white people who had civilization, and it became very easy to justify the enslavement. So that is where we start to see a slavery based on an actual racial or ethnic characteristic. In fact, within a century, this word, which is an Arabic word, would change its definition to mean Black male. And that happened in about a century. So the idea of Blackness and slaveness really began to become very, very ingrained. And so a lot of the African population was initially enslaved out into these other parts of the world, as well as within this region. Now, We also begin seeing some contact between white Europeans who were not leftovers from the Roman Empire, along with other large African empires in these regions as well. And what began to happen is the first Europeans to pick up on the idea of enslaving Africans were the Genoese, what is now Italy. They took a look and saw that Arabs enslaved Africans. And so why reinvent the wheel here? We'll pick up where they left off, or we'll pick up with what they're doing. Mainly for the sugar islands that the Genoese had in the Caribbean. So Genoa is now part of Italy, if you're wondering who are these people. But they were the first ones, because of their trade contact with North Africa. They ran across the enslavement of Africans, took the idea there. Then it was picked up by the Portuguese. For their sugar islands, mainly along the coast here. And then picked up by Spain for their sugar islands in the Caribbean. And so it sort of starts here in the 14th century, and then it's picked up by the Portuguese in the 15th century, and then eventually Spain bringing it to the New World, the Caribbean islands, in the 16th century. And eventually, the British would pick up on it in the Caribbean as well. Now, as to the main English colonies in America, slavery did not immediately take root, partly for reason number one: there were enough indentured servants that slaves weren't needed, excuse me, particularly in Virginia. Tobacco, I told you I was a terrible typist, tobacco is a low labor crop. You don't need a lot of labor for tobacco. And what labor was needed in Virginia came from the white indentured servants. And second, slavery was seen as a Spanish tradition. And of course, the English hated the Spanish. So an Englishman was not going to dress like a Spaniard or eat like a Spaniard or embrace slavery like a Spaniard. So for these early English American colonies, slavery really doesn't immediately set hold. If we look at 1619 at Jamestown is when we start to see the first 20 and some odd, I'll give you the exact quote from John Rolfe. Apparently a Dutch pirate ship came to Jamestown and sold off some slaves they had captured raiding on the Spanish. Now, we don't know if these 20 and some odd became slaves right away. There is some evidence to suggest, to more than suggest, that some of them simply passed through the indentured servant system, which we talked about back in the video on Jamestown, lecture number 2. Others, though, appear to have become slaves for life, but there's no evidence of slavery passing to children in those early records, which are not in this particular file. Let me see if I can find that real quick. Just give me a second. Where are see if I can find this real quick. No, it's not in here later. But a survey done around 1660, a census, listed black servants, but the problem is the word for servant was the same word used for slave. So we really don't know if some of them were slaves or some of them were simply indentured servants. And the laws regarding slavery were a confused jumble, probably depending on which part of Virginia you were in as to whether or not slavery would be permanent or temporary or an indentured servant thing or what that happened. We know from court cases that slaves were able to get out of slavery if you were baptized into Christianity. You could sue for freedom. We have court transcripts of where that happened. If you could prove that your father was a free person, you could also sue for your freedom. So very early on, we see ways for people to get out of slavery. And so it's a very confusing sort of mishmash of laws. Now, by 1700, slaves for life plus children. So it had really clamped down by 1700 into the version of slavery that we're familiar with. The pivotal reason for that, from about 1680 to about 1700, the slave population vastly increased. Okay. And so as more and more Africans were being brought to the Americas, the laws became much more rigid and loopholes were closed. Why did the slave population increase? One, start here. Declining supply of white indentured servants. After 16, and this had been going on probably since the 1670s, we see a lot of paperwork, letters, and whatnot from the 1670s talking about the lack, there aren't enough servants, there aren't enough indentured servants for the colonies. That was largely due to a drop in the birth rate in England itself. And there were a lot more jobs opening up in England itself. So it wasn't really necessary to get on a boat and go all the way to the New World to find economic opportunity. You could now stay in England and do that. At the same time, the plantation system was spreading. The Carolinas were now being settled in this period, and the plantations were not only getting bigger, but there were more and more of them. So at the same time that your labor supply is dropping, your need for labor is going up. And so you have to find the third labor force. And then finally, the third reason, beginning of the English slave trade lowered prices. Until about the 1670s, slaves were supplied by either the Dutch or the Spanish. The English will get into the slave system and begin bringing them over, and that will lower prices. And as more and more came in, the laws became much more rigid about slavery. The loopholes began to be closed. And so again, by 1700, it was slaves for life plus the children. Okay. Here are slaves. This looks like tobacco drying here. Leaves are being hung. Now, the experience of a slave either brought to America or born in America really depended on what part of the world they wound up in, or what part of America they wound up in. So geographically speaking, we have what is called the Low Country, and that is going to be the Carolinas and Georgia once Georgia gets slavery. And then the Chesapeake, and that's going to be your Virginia, Maryland, Delaware region, okay, right where the Chesapeake Bay is. And then finally, what we're going to call the North, but don't think of this as a north-south divide. That doesn't exist yet. But this would basically be New York, New Jersey, and then, of course, New England and Pennsylvania. So the experience of a slave, whether born into slavery or brought over as a slave, really depends on which of these three areas they wind up in. So let's start with population. And let me fix this. Okay, the highest population of slaves is going to be found in the Low Country. There will be places where slaves will outnumber whites 6-1, 7-1, 10-1. All right. The North, as you go further north, you find fewer and fewer slaves. A lot of that has to do with small farms and the Puritan work ethic. Okay. The Puritans were very big on working with your hands, your own hands. And there was some moral objections to slavery as well in the North. So the general rule of thumb is the further north you go, the fewer and fewer slaves you're going to find. And then as far as a middle ground, the Chesapeake area, not as many slaves as the Low Country, but certainly more slaves than what you would find in the northern areas. Okay. Laws regarding slave behavior are going to be the strictest in the area where you have the highest number of slaves. So if you lived in the Low Country, pretty much there was a law that regulated your behavior from when you woke up to when you went to sleep. Okay. Slaves couldn't travel without passes. They couldn't congregate in groups larger than 3. Those type of laws would have been found in the Low Country. Up north, again, if you don't have a very large population of slaves, you don't really need a whole lot of laws regulating their behavior. So you find less and less slave laws as you make your way further and further north. And then again, the Chesapeake, sort of the middle ground between the two extremes. And then finally, heritage. Okay? That is to say, African heritage. How much is retained? Again, where you have the highest concentration of slaves, the most retention of heritage. Okay, so things like marriage rights, burial rights, naming customs, religion. Okay, those things are going to be more likely retained where you have the highest number of Africans. Even though for a lot of it, it'll be a blending of different African heritage, because people will often come from different tribes and they will synthesize new heritage out of their old heritage. In the North, again, if you don't have a whole lot of Africans, you're going to have the least retention of heritage. Okay, if you're the only African or even native born Black in the place where you live, then there's not a lot of other people who remember, and so very little is going to be retained or passed along. And once again, the Chesapeake functioning as a sort of middle ground between the two. So again, your experience as a slave really does depend on which of these 3 sections of the country you're in. Now, once we start moving towards the Mississippi and across the Mississippi, things will change. Abolition will certainly wipe out slavery in these parts, but let's just focus on slavery as it is here now. Resistance was also pretty common as well. And resistance, again, would also be based on how long you've been here, what part of the country you were on, and so on. The first type of resistance is simply running away. Okay? And runaways typically break down into 2 different categories. The first is what were called saltwater slaves. And these are typically less than a year in America. Okay, so they're still very new to the country and to their surroundings. When they get a chance to run away, they will tend to run in groups to the frontier. Okay. they are going to run away from wherever there are any white people at for obvious reasons. The problem, though, is that they're not really aware of the dangers of the frontier with regards to Native Americans. So Native Americans might capture them for the reward or just kill them, knowing how valuable they are to white people. Before that, when they're on the frontier, they will attempt to recreate the life they knew in Africa on the American frontier. They will attempt to rebuild their lives in this new, strange land. And it's unfortunate that we don't have any information about how they did this or how successful. Again, we're not sending a lot of anthropologists out there. They're being hunted down by their owners or by the Native Americans. And so we know it happened. We just don't know what it looked like, which is unfortunate. I think it would be interesting to see how they were able to rebuild, even for a short time, the lives they had. And then the other type of slaves, we'll call them native slaves. They've either been here a while or were born into slavery. When they get a chance to run, they will typically run north and try to disappear into the cities. They will also run alone. They do not go west because they are aware of Native Americans. Okay. And they know that the natives might kill them or will probably just turn them in for the reward money. Now, if they live far enough south, instead of heading north, far enough south, they will try to get to Spanish Florida. Spain welcomes escaped slaves. One, it pisses off the English, but also Spain is always looking for more help for the border patrol. So if you're a slave and you're far enough south, you might head for Florida and attempt to disappear into that part of the world. And enough did for it to constantly be a pain in the butt for people living in the southern colonies and then later in the southern states after the American Revolution. The next type of slave resistance is passive resistance. And this would involve working slow, breaking tools, faking an illness. Okay, you do just enough work, not get into trouble. Okay. We have all done passive resistance with our parents at some point in our lives, whether it's mowing the lawn or cleaning our room. We have done just enough of a good job to avoid any further hassle from parental units. Same thing with slaves. Okay? Work slow, break the axe, maybe kill an animal. Okay? Same thing. It's going to do just the least amount of work we have to do. And then finally, the last type of resistance is active resistance. And that is when people start to die. Slave rebellions. And slave rebellions happened quite a bit. There are 5 major slave rebellions before the Civil War, and there are some minor ones. But occasionally the slaves would figure out a way to arm themselves and start killing for their freedom. The biggest slave rebellion before the American Revolution was the Stono Rebellion in 1739, South Carolina. This happens here outside of Charlestown. It's now, of course, Charleston, but as best as anyone has put together, a smallpox epidemic caused the whites to stop constantly monitoring slaves, got weapons, and let things take their natural course. This is a woodcut from the Stono Rebellion. Numbers are hard to come by. I've seen 80 slaves participate. I've seen it as high as 150. So why don't we just say about 120 slaves participated. I've seen the death toll somewhere in the low hundreds as well. That far south, they're going to have to go to Florida. And for reasons that we don't know, because there are no survivors, they stopped. Probably for food, water. Killing people with knives and axes is exhausting. So they probably needed to rest, and the militia caught up with them and killed them all. So that's why we don't exactly know what happened in terms of why they stopped in the course of the rebellion, or in the course of fleeing to Florida. We can only speculate. Now, lest you think this is just a Southern thing, in less than 10 years later, 2 years later, in New York, the rumor of a slave uprising, just the rumor, no actions, just the rumor, led to 30 executions of slaves and deportations to the West Indies for others. And getting deported to the West Indies is a death sentence. It's just a slower death sentence because you'll be worked to death there. So again, this is not just a Southern paranoia. Again, simply the rumor of a slave uprising leads New York to execute some slaves and deport others to a slow death in the West Indies. All right. Turning our attention now to the 7 Years' War, or you've probably heard it called the French and Indian War, but we're going to call it the 7 Years' War. It should come as no surprise that Britain and France decided to go to war with each other, because Britain and France fought 3 wars between 1689 and 1748. So it should come as no surprise that Britain and France are going to fight each other again. There is a key difference. These previous wars, these three wars, have begun in Europe and spilled over to America. The 7 Years' War will reverse that. The 7 Years' War will begin in America and spread to Europe. Okay, so very, very different beginning for this particular war. This is a French map of North America from about 1720. And you can see here, this region down here in pink, the English are in this green area. Okay? And the Spanish are in this yellow area. Map isn't exactly right. And the French are this pink. And the French decided they were taking this as well, the Ohio Valley. This is an English map of America showing England having the Ohio Valley. So this whole war is going to break out over control of the Ohio Valley, which today is Ohio, Indiana, and Illinois, those three states. Why? The Ohio Valley has some of America's most fertile soil. For a long time, the Ohio Valley was called America's breadbasket. So it's very, very fertile soil. The French want it. The British also want it. France makes the first move. In 1754, France built a fort at the Three Rivers. Okay. It's Fort Duquesne. Fort Pitt comes later, but this is called Fort Duquesne. And it's right there where the three rivers come together, the Allegheny, the Monongahela, and the Ohio. You do not have to know the names of the rivers. But this is where Pittsburgh is now. That's why when I was growing up, the Steelers played at Three Rivers Stadium. So the French put their fort right here to block access into the Ohio Valley, which is right here. Fort Pitt will come later. A meeting was held. Same year, we're still in 1754. A meeting called the Albany Meeting, and this was a meeting of many of the colonies who had claims to the Ohio Valley. So Pennsylvania, Virginia, some people from New York, some people from Pennsylvania, I already said Pennsylvania. Not all the colonies, but a bunch of the colonies. And I don't have an exact number, but a lot. Okay, and of course, the whole purpose is for this meeting is to get the French out. We got to come up with a plan to get those French people out of the Ohio Valley. Now, one person is thinking ahead to the future, and that's Benjamin Franklin. Franklin, I really cannot type, liked the idea of the colonies coming together over common concerns, which didn't happen very often. The colonies were really very isolated, particularly by regions. So a person in Massachusetts really didn't know a whole lot about what was going on, probably south of New York. And the person in Georgia didn't know anything about what was going on, probably any further than Virginia. Communication was pretty poor, and it was really only over the last decade that the colonies had slowly begun to learn more about each other outside of their regions. Obviously, if you lived in New York, you probably knew a lot about what was going on in Virginia and Pennsylvania. Those are your neighbors, but maybe not so much about further south or even further north. So Franklin thought it was a good idea for the colonies to meet like this. And so Franklin came up with what was called the Albany Plan. And this called for a Grand Council of the colonies. And they would be responsible for defense, expansion, and natives. Okay? Because defense, expansion, and natives are something that all the colonies have to deal with to some extent or another, except probably for a few of the Atlantic seaboard, probably Massachusetts. No, I think maybe Massachusetts might be the only one. The other colonies still had natives to some extent in them. The plan, although a good plan, is rejected because it would require all claims to Ohio Valley be dropped. And nobody wanted to do that. Pennsylvania didn't want to drop its claims. Virginia didn't want to drop its claims. And so here's Franklin with a really good idea. He's about 10 years ahead of his time. But because everybody has claims to the Ohio Valley, nobody wants to give up their claims. And so Franklin's brilliant idea is rejected. Well, Virginia sends its own militia to drive out the French. And that is led by George Washington, who was a colonel of the Virginia Regiment. Washington did a little mapping while he was out there. He is a surveyor, so this is there's the Ohio, and you can see the other two rivers. So Fort Duquesne would be right about in here. Washington never even got close to Fort Duquesne. He was attacked, ambushed by the French and the Indians. Had to retreat to Fort Necessity. Then it began to rain. And the fort was really not in a very good place. So the fort actually began to flood. And so Washington was forced to surrender, and I'm not making this up, on July 4th. And Washington was aware years later of the significance of the date of July 4th in his own life. Britain heard about this, Parliament, and so Parliament sent sorry, I got the year wrong on this, 1754. So Parliament sent a real British army to deal with French. About 2,300 British regulars. This is 1755. All right, so obviously these colonials don't know what they're doing, so we're going to send a real army out there. Well, That British army of 2,300 people gets wiped out trying to cross the Monongahela River. You can see the French and the Indians on one side. You can see the British out in the riverside attempting to cross. If we look at the note down here, 400 dead British, another 400 wounded, about 10 miles south of Fort Duquesne. So that didn't go too well. So much for our real British Army. But as a result of this, in 1756, Britain declares war on France. And this war, again, will come to engulf much of Europe. As you can see here, the English and their allies are in blue. So England, Portugal colonies, and some of the Germanic versus the French and their allies, France, Spain, what will one day be Germany, which is still the Holy Roman Empire, and the Russians up here. So this is really a world war. Again, and it's a world war that breaks out over control of the Ohio Valley. For the first 2 years, the British don't do well in America. Okay, Britain wins in Europe. They are winning at sea. They are not winning in America. Okay. There are a series of defeats, as we can see here. Most of the war being fought sort of along this frontier area, but an awful lot of French victories, Ticonderoga, Fort William Henry, some British victories, but mainly you see a lot of French victories right in this area. This was due to a couple of reasons. One, natives were largely backing the French. Remember that the French have always treated the natives as equals. And so that is now paying dividends because natives are either backing the French or sitting this out. So the British have no native allies. And the British are also trying to fight the war on the cheap. So they're not spending the kind of money that's necessary to prosecute the war in North America. But the big problem, yeah, up here, natives are simply backing the French or simply sitting this one out. Things begin to change in 1758. Two important developments for the British. First of all, British capture the St. Lawrence River. Now, the St. Lawrence River is the river that France uses to resupply its manpower into French Canada. All right, the British are going to capture that. So France no longer has a way to resupply its troops in Canada. The second thing that happens the Iroquois Confederacy sides with the British. The Iroquois Confederacy, which I appear to have, okay. Iroquois Confederacy is made up of 6 tribes. New York, Canada. They had been sitting this one out, probably waiting to see who was going to win so they could make sure they were on the winning side. I respect that. But the Iroquois Confederacy began to see which way the wind was going to blow. And so the Iroquois sided with the British, and the British have also cut off French resupply by capturing the mouth of the St. Lawrence. That doesn't need to be here. And so things turn in Britain's way. In September 1759, in September of 1759, the British, under the command of Thomas Wolfe, capture Quebec. You can see here, and then are on the move to Montreal when the French finally decide that it's over. The French have lost in Europe, they've lost on the Atlantic, and now they're losing in America. France decides to stop fighting. It takes 3 years to get a peace treaty. This is called the Treaty of Paris. This is the 1763 version of the Treaty of Paris, where basically France loses North American Empire. So this whole empire in green, going all the way back to Cartier, LaSalle, Champlain, all those guys, France loses all of this. Everything in green, France loses. There's some territorial exchanging in Europe. We don't need to know about that. But France loses its entire empire. Impacts of the 7 Years' War as far as they relate to America. First, British national debt has doubled because of the war. And that is going to lead Britain to begin a new taxation program, which we'll look at how that goes in Unit 2. But Britain has some serious debts to pay off, and it is going to try and collect those debts from the Americans. And we'll look at how that goes in Unit 2. Second, France. France recognized that their navy had really been a weak point for them. And so France is going to begin a massive naval buildup. That is also going to affect America in about the next 15 to 18 years. We'll see that when we get to Unit 2. Third, Louisiana Territory goes to Spain. Even though France had won, even though Britain had won all of this, they gave about half of it to the Spanish for some territorial concessions in Europe that we don't need to worry about. Okay. But everything from about New Orleans up the Mississippi on this side is going to become Spanish territory. And that's going to we'll look in Unit 2 and Unit 3 how that works out for the Spanish. Fourth, military training for Americans. George Washington, Nathaniel Greene, Benedict Arnold, Henry Knox, all these people that we know from the American Revolution, Light Horse Harry Lee, they all got their start in the 7 Years' War, learning how to be soldiers, but also learning that the British were not invincible. And so that's also going to have an effect on America's future. That is the end of Unit 1. Okay. If you have any questions between now and then, please be sure to hit me up. One thing I forgot to talk about in class, it's talked about in your reading, are the tithing men. If you go back to the section on Puritans, the tithing men were basically church leaders. Again, this is Puritans, who could come into your house and look at all your stuff, make sure you are raising your children in a proper Christian household. If you weren't, they could take your kids away. Your reading mentions them. They are talked about in the readings, but they're also in the study guide under the terms under the New England. Okay. So that is the end of these lectures for Unit 1, and I will see you on June 10th for your examination. All right. Have a good rest of your week.